I found it in a basement in lower Manhattan, tucked behind a load-bearing pillar that the city's official blueprints claimed didn't exist. It was a ledger, bound in a hide that felt too cold to be calfskin, its edges charred as if someone had tried to feed it to a furnace and then thought better of it. The ink was a deep, corrosive violet. It didn't list names, it listed weights. Tons of masonry, cubic meters of displaced earth, thousands of souls categorized not by lineage but by their capacity for silence. Ask yourself why a municipal record for a 19th century sewer project would require a classification for atmospheric pressure anomalies. Ask yourself why the granite blocks at the base of the Brooklyn Bridge share a chemical signature with ruins in the Gobi Desert. They tell us the past is a solid foundation, a linear progression from primitive toil to enlightened steel. But when you look at the stones, truly look at them, you see the scars of a different story. Not a slow ascent, not a natural evolution, a jagged severance. The anomaly was small at first, a staircase in a Chicago townhouse that led upward into a ceiling of solid pre-fire brick, a window in a Prague cellar that looked out onto 6 feet of packed ancient silt. We call it the mud flood to simplify the terror of it, but the term is a mask. It suggests a natural disaster, a fluke of geology. But nature does not lay bricks in perfect geometric grids across 3 continents simultaneously. Nature does not erase the architectural heritage of a global civilization and replace it with neoclassical facades in the span of a single generation. What if the great exhibitions of the 1800s weren't celebrations of progress, but massive liquidation sales of a conquered reality? They built these white cities out of staff and plaster, temporary shells intended to burn, hiding the indestructible ruins beneath them. Look at the photographs from 1893. The scale is impossible. The technology to produce such grandeur in months did not exist. Not then, not now. Something else was happening. Something was being harvested. As I traced the violet ink of that ledger, a pattern began to emerge, stretching like a necrotic vein across the map. The displaced were not merely moved, they were redistributed. The census records of the mid-1800s are a graveyard of ghost populations. Millions of people appearing in port cities with no point of origin, their eyes hollow, their hands scarred by the handling of refined mercury. They were sent to the asylums. They were sent to the orphanages. They were sent to the work camps hidden beneath the guise of westward expansion. Institutional erasure is not a passive process. It is an active, violent scrubbing of the collective memory. They tell us Tartaria was a cartographic error, a vague term for a vast, empty wilderness. But maps from the 1600s show cities where we are told there were only nomadic tents. They show power plants where we are told there was only wood smoke. What if the survivors were not refugees of a war, but remnants of a frequency? The ledger mentions the dampening. It describes the installation of iron rods into the bedrock of every major capital, a global grounding wire designed to short-circuit a world that ran on the very air it breathed. The star forts that dot our coastlines are not fortifications, they are resonators. Look at the geometry. Look at the load distribution. They were designed to handle energy, not cannon fire. When the frequency was changed, the survivors became obsolete. Their technology became magic, their history became myth, and their bodies became labor. They were sent into the mines to dig up the very foundations of their own ancestors, told that they were pioneers settling a virgin land. Not a discovery, not a settlement, a reclamation of stolen goods. I followed the trail to the derelict sanitariums of the Pacific Northwest, places where the walls are 3 feet thick and the basements are flooded with a brackish metallic water. In the intake logs, the same violet ink reappears. The patients weren't treated for madness. They were treated for residual resonance. They spoke of a sun that didn't burn, of towers that hummed in the key of F sharp, of a history where the stars were closer than the moon. The doctors recorded these as delusions, yet the physical evidence tells a different story. The skeletons found in the potter's fields of these institutions exhibit a bone density 30% higher than the modern average. Their teeth show traces of rare earth elements that don't occur naturally in the local soil. They weren't from here, or rather, they were from a here that no longer exists. The institutional gatekeeping is absolute. Try to access the geological surveys of the 1870s and you will find administrative gaps. Try to photograph the sub-basements of the Smithsonian and you will find yourself escorted out by men who don't wear badges that carry the authority of centuries. They are guarding the transition point. They are hiding the fact that our modern world is a parasite living on the corpse of a giant. We inhabit their buildings. We use their repurposed plumbing, and we tell ourselves we built it all with horses and handsaws. It is a comforting lie. It protects us from the realization that we are the secondary occupants. We are the inheritors of a crime so vast it has no name. Ask yourself why every great city of the old world suffered a great fire between 1850 and 1910. London, Chicago, Boston, Moscow, San Francisco. It is the signature of a clean slate. You cannot rewrite history if the evidence is still standing, so you burn the evidence and build a myth on the ashes. The survivors were ushered into the foundling hospitals, a term that sounds charitable until you realize the sheer volume of children processed through them. A generation of orphans with no surnames, no lineages, and no memories. They were the blank pages upon which the new history was written. They were the ones sent to the colonies to act as the front line of a forced amnesia. The deeper I go into the urban ruins, the more the somber weight of the truth presses down. In the abandoned subway tunnels of Cincinnati, there are sections where the brickwork changes abruptly from scorched red to a shimmering vitrified black. It is the mark of intense, focused heat, the kind of heat that shouldn't have been possible in the 19th century. Beside these patches, I found carvings, not graffiti, but precise, mathematical notations. They look like circuit diagrams. They look like prayers. I think they are both. They represent the final attempts of a dying culture to calculate the exact moment their reality would be turned off. There is a resonance in the silence of these places that is intellectually provocative and deeply unsettling. It challenges the very notion of time as a linear progression. If a global civilization could be erased so thoroughly in less than 100 years, what does that say about the permanence of our own? We are told we are at the pinnacle of human achievement, yet we cannot recreate the acoustic properties of a 17th century cathedral or the structural integrity of a Tartarian star fort. We are a regression disguised as progress. We are the survivors of a shipwreck who have forgotten how to sail, huddled on the deck of a ghost ship we call civilization. The final entries in the ledger don't end in words. They end in coordinates, locations in the high Arctic, the deep Sahara, and the forbidden zones of the American Southwest. These are the silent zones, places where the satellites glitch and the compasses spin in useless circles. This is where they were sent, the ones who wouldn't forget, the ones who still carried the resonance in their marrow. They weren't sent there to live, they were sent there to be outside of time. and as I stand in the shadow of a skyscraper built atop it, foundation it can never understand, I have to ask, are they still there, waiting for the frequency to change back? Or are we the ones who are truly lost, wandering through a museum of a world we were never meant to inherit? The coordinates led me to a high altitude plateau in the Andes, a place where the air is so thin it feels like glass in your lungs. Here, the erasure is not hidden by urban sprawl, but by the sheer indifference of the landscape. I found the remains of a settlement that the official archaeological record dismisses as a temporary mining camp from the 1890s, but miners do not build with polygonal masonry that fits together without mortar, nor do they carve intricate fractal patterns into the undersides of their lintels. This was a terminal, a place of transit for those the ledger identified as the unassimilated. I spent nights listening to the wind howl through the hollowed out stone, and it didn't sound like wind. It sounded like a choir of thousands, low frequency hum that vibrated the very fillings in my teeth. Ask yourself why the world's most powerful telescopes are located in these desolate zones. Is it to look at the stars, or is it to monitor the signal that still emanates from the ground beneath them? I began to compare the architectural DNA of these remote sites with the grand structures of the 1904 World's Fair. The similarities are not merely stylistic, they are functional. The load distribution in a St. Louis pavilion mirrored the energy harvesting spires of the Tibetan highlands. This is the global pattern the gatekeepers work so hard to obscure. They want us to see disconnected cultures, a fragmented history of isolated tribes. But the stones speak of a unified grid, not a collection of nations, a single, integrated machine. The institutional erasure of Tartaria was necessary because you cannot enslave a population that knows it once had access to free, wireless energy. You must first make them believe in scarcity. You must make them believe that they are small, that they are weak, and that their ancestors were even smaller. The tense silence of the archives in Santiago provided the next piece of the puzzle. I found a collection of photographs suppressed for over a century showing re-education camps in the southern tip of Patagonia. These were not the primitive tents of the indigenous population. These were massive, stone-walled complexes equipped with copper dome towers. The survivors were kept there not for punishment but for extraction. The journals of the overseers, men with names that appear on the boards of directors for the first central banks, describe the process of bleeding the memory. They used the towers to broadcast a dissonant frequency that disrupted the human biofield, inducing a state of permanent amnesia, not a teaching of new things, an unlearning of everything. What if the orphan trains that crisscrossed America were the final stage of this extraction? We are told they were a humanitarian effort to find homes for the displaced children of the slums, but the numbers don't add up. Hundreds of thousands of children, expertly scrubbed of their pasts, distributed across the vast interior of a continent that was being systematically reset. They were the labour force for the New World, raised to believe that the ruins they were clearing were the works of a primitive enemy or the natural formations of a wild land. They were the architects of their own cage, unknowingly dismantling the remnants of their parents' glory to build the factories of their masters. I moved to the Mediterranean, following the trail of the vitrified forts. These are structures where the stone has been melted into glass, a process requiring temperatures exceeding 3,000 degrees. This was not the result of a fire or a siege. This was the result of a directed energy weapon, a final strike against the holdouts of the old world. The erasure trope is most visible here, where the official history books call these ruins volcanic anomalies. But volcanoes do not create 90-degree angles. Volcanoes do not leave behind the skeletons of children clutching iron keys. Something else was used here, something that turned the very walls into a furnace. The skepticism of authority becomes a survival mechanism when you realize the depth of the deception. I interviewed a retired surveyor for the French railway system who claimed to have found entire cities preserved in the bedrock beneath the Pyrenees. He spoke of lights that still glowed without a power source and doors that would only open to a specific vocal pitch. He was silenced, of course. His pension was revoked. His records were seized and he was moved to a high-security assisted living facility. But he gave me a map. Not a map of the surface, a map of the underflow. It showed a network of tunnels connecting every major capital of the old world, a subterranean nervous system that predates the modern era by millennia. As I navigated these hidden passages beneath Paris, the sombre reality of the survivors' fate became clear. They didn't just disappear into the camps or the orphanages. Some of them went down. They retreated into the deep crust, hoping to preserve the resonance until the surface was safe again. But the gatekeepers followed. They sealed the vents. They flooded the shafts. They turned the sanctuaries into tombs. The catacombs we see today, filled with the bones of millions, are not the overflow of city cemeteries. They are the mass graves of the last Tartarians, stacked in geometric patterns to neutralize their residual energy. It is a grotesque irony. We use their bones as a tourist attraction while walking on the very ground they died to protect. Rhythmic, staccato footsteps echoed behind me as I explored the deeper levels of the London Underground, past the ghost stations that don't appear on any commuter map. The air here smells of ozone and ancient damp. I found a chamber lined with lead-shielded boxes. Inside were not documents, but cylinders of a strange translucent alloy. When touched, they vibrate with a frequency that induces a feeling of profound loss. They are time capsules of the soul. They contain the harmonic signatures of the world that was stolen. The institutions know about these chambers. They monitor them. They fear the day the lead cracks and the resonance leaks back into the collective consciousness. Ask yourself, what would happen if the hum returned? If the towers were reactivated and the scarcity myth crumbled? The entire structure of modern power, the banks, the governments, the religions, relies on the silence of the stones. They have built a world of shadows and told us it is the only light. But the shadows are thinning, the mud is drying, the skeletons in the potter's fields are starting to speak in the language of mathematics and light. It is not a matter of if the truth will emerge, but when. The weight of the lies becomes too great for the foundation to hold. I returned to the basement in Manhattan, back to the hidden pillar and the violet ink ledger. I realized then that the ledger wasn't just a record of the past, it was a blueprint for the future. The same weights, the same displacements, the same categorizations of unassimilated populations are being recorded again. The cycle is repeating. A new erasure is being prepared, a new reset to hide the failures of the current parasitic elite. We are the survivors of tomorrow, being moved into the new smart cities that are just refined versions of the old work camps. The philosophical open loop remains. Are we capable of breaking the cycle, or are we destined to become the bones in the next generation's catacombs? A mystery for a future investigator to uncover in the ruins of our own forgotten world. The trail didn't end in the tunnels. It bled into the high desert silence of the American Four Corners. Here, the red rock formations are told to be the product of eons of erosion, wind, and water. But the investigator must be wary of the geological narrative provided by those who own the universities. If you look at the mesas with a skeptical eye, the load distribution reveals something else entirely. These are not natural plateaus, they are the slag heaps of a planetary scale mining operation, the discarded husks of a world stripped of its primary elements. The survivors were not merely sent to these arid zones to perish, they were sent to be the custodial staff of a dying battery. I found a collection of petroglyphs near a restricted military installation that depicted not hunters or animals, but precise geometric arrays that looked hauntingly like the circuit boards found in modern telecommunications. Not primitive art, not shamanic visions, schematic diagrams of the atmospheric harvest. The institutional gatekeeping in the American West is particularly aggressive. Whole swaths of land are marked as national parks or indigenous reserves, labels that sound protective but function as a velvet curtain. Behind this curtain, the evidence of the Great Reset is being systematically pulverized. In the 1880s, the Smithsonian sent teams to excavate the mounds of the Mississippi Valley and the cliff dwellings of the Southwest. What they found didn't fit the Darwinian timeline. They found giants. They found copper-clad kings with double rows of teeth. They found survivors of the Tartarian collapse who still possessed the knowledge of the stars. And then the records vanished. The artifacts were lost in transit or burned in accidental warehouse fires. The pattern is staccato, constant, relentless. Erasure is the only way to maintain the illusion of the pioneer. What if the Wild West was a choreographed clean-up operation? Ask yourself why the first thing built in every dusty frontier town was a massive, ornate courthouse or a brick-and-mortar bank that looked 1,000 years old. They weren't building them, they were unearthing them. The pioneers were merely the tenants moved in to occupy the upper floors, while the lower floors remained buried under 15 feet of flood sediment. The history of the cowboy is a distraction, a rugged myth designed to cover the reality of a technocratic salvage mission. The survivors, the ones who knew how to operate the machinery, how to draw power from the ionosphere, how to heal with sound, were categorized as outlaws or hostiles. They were hunted not for their land, but for their silence. I tracked a series of ledger entries to an abandoned asylum in the Nevada desert, a place where the sun bleaches the wood to a bone white. The intake forms here were different. They didn't list symptoms. They listed vibrational deviance. One patient, a woman identified only as subject 742, had been transferred from a foundling hospital in New York. Her crime was her inability to forget the singing towers. She described a city where the buildings were not stone, but a living, resonant, crystalline structure. The doctors used early electroshock therapy not to cure her, but to tune her. They were trying to find the frequency of the old world so they could jam it forever. The tension in her handwritten letters is palpable. She knew she was the last of a frequency, a single note in a song that was being forcibly silenced. The skeletal remains found in the crawl spaces of these desert facilities tell a somber story. They are often found with small metallic discs tucked into their rib cages. When I analysed one of these discs using a makeshift spectrometer, the results were intellectually provocative. It wasn't an alloy known to 19th century metallurgy. It was a semi-conductive ceramic etched with micro grooves that mirrored the star forts of the Atlantic coast. These were the memory keys, the final repositories of a culture that knew it was being overwritten. They weren't buried with their gold, they were buried with their data. And now we build our data centers on top of their graves, as if the silicon chips are trying to drink the residual knowledge from the soil. Contrast the scale of their ambition with the pettiness of our own. They built for eternity, for harmony, for the collective advancement of the human spirit. We build for the next fiscal quarter, for the next planned obsolescence, for the next cycle of debt. The revisionist documentary of our era will not be a celebration of our tech. It will be an autopsy of our amnesia. The gatekeepers know that if we ever realize these asylums were actually centers of ancestral suppression, the entire psychological framework of the modern citizen would collapse. We are not the descendants of primitive apes. We are the amnesiac children of gods, wandering through the ruins of our own nursery, told that the broken toys are ancient mysteries. I found a photograph in a private collection in Zurich, dated 1871. It shows a street in San Francisco, supposedly moments after a minor earthquake, but the shadows are wrong. The light is coming from the ground, a soft, bioluminescent glow emanating from the cracks in the pavement. There are no horses, there are no gas lamps. There are only the survivors, standing in the middle of the street, looking up at a sky that is filled with shimmering, iridescent ribbons of energy. This was the moment of the shift. This was the moment the ground was shorted out and the atmospheric power was cut. The somber expressions on their faces aren't fear. They are the look of a people who have just realized they have been disconnected from the source of life. The institutional erasure extends even to the way we perceive time. The introduction of the standardized Gregorian calendar and the suppression of lunar-based systems was the final nail in the coffin. By disconnecting us from the natural rhythms of the earth, the gatekeepers ensured we would never again be in sync with the resonance of the star forts. We were placed on a linear, ticking clock, a treadmill of labour that ensures we never have the stillness required to hear the hum. Not a choice, not a coincidence, a calculated frequency lock. The survivors were sent to the outskirts because the outskirts are where the clock is loudest, where the struggle for survival drowns out the memory of the singing towers. Is it possible that some of them are still there in the unorganized territories of the world maps? What if the disappearances in our national parks are not accidents, but reunions? Every year, thousands of people vanish without a trace in the exact locations marked as silent zones in the violet ledger. They aren't taken by predators. They aren't lost in the woods. They are walking into the pockets of the old world that still vibrate at the original frequency. They are returning to the resonance, and the authorities, terrified that the leak will spread, respond with more fences, more restricted zones, and more stories about feral humans to keep the public from looking too closely at the gaps in reality. As I sit in the shadow of a mesa that was once a cathedral of light, the mystery feels less like a puzzle and more like a mourning. The survivors were sent away, but they left the doors unlocked. The evidence is everywhere, in the load distribution of our bridges, in the chemical signatures of our foundations, and in the persistent, unsettling feeling that our history is a lie told by a frightened winner. Ask yourself, if you were the last person to remember the truth, would you hide it in a book? Or would you hide it in the very architecture of the world, waiting for someone with the right eyes to read the stones? The investigative essayist can only point to the cracks. It is up to you to see what is leaking through. The violet ink of the Manhattan ledger had one more secret to yield, a series of shipping manifests that redirected my search toward the frozen silence of the North. We are taught that the Victorian era was one of relentless maritime exploration, a heroic push into the white blank spaces of the globe. But what if those expeditions weren't seeking new lands, but were actually cleaning up the old ones? The manifests detail tons of cultural refuse being shipped to the Svalbard archipelago and the northernmost reaches of Greenland. Not coal, not timber, refuse. When you cross-reference these shipments with the dates of the Great Fires, a chilling rhythm emerges. As the cities burned, the past was being crated and sent to the permafrost. The survivors who refused the re-education of the orphanages were sent with it. They were sent to the edge of the world, where the magnetic flux is most volatile, to act as the living insulation for a history that had to be frozen to be forgotten. I travelled to a decommissioned research station on the coast of Ellesmere Island, a place where the sun is a stranger for half the year. In the substructures of the facility, buried beneath layers of reinforced concrete, I found the echo chambers. These were not laboratories for meteorological study. They were acoustic isolation cells. The walls were lined with a composite of mica and lead, materials designed to dampen the very resonance I had tracked from the star forts of the temperate zones. I found a diary of a site commander from 1912. He didn't write about the weather. He wrote about the howling. He described the prisoners, men and women with skin like translucent porcelain, who would sit in the centre of their cells and hum a single, perfect note for 20 hours a day. He wrote that the hum made the metal of the station glow. He wrote that he had to execute them because the sound was infecting the machinery of the modern world. Ask yourself why the endurance expeditions and the race for the poles were funded by the same families who established the global banking cartels. It wasn't about the glory of the flag. It was about the perimeter. They had to ensure that the atmospheric drain was complete. They had to make sure the survivors in the ice hadn't succeeded in restarting the grid. Institutional erasure is easiest when the evidence is buried under 1,000 feet of ice. The technical term for this is cryosanitization. If you cannot burn the truth, you freeze it. You turn the most advanced cities of the old world into glaciers and tell the future that they are merely natural accidents of a cooling planet. But ice doesn't form in perfect 90-degree angles, and glaciers don't contain the brass clockwork of a civilization that harnessed the stars. The skepticism of authority is never more necessary than when looking at the world seed vaults and the high security installations of the Arctic. They tell us they are preserving life for a future catastrophe. What if they are actually guarding the remains of a past one? I found evidence of a great thaw in the confidential records of an oil exploration company, a sudden localized melting of a glacier in 1974 that revealed a spire of iridescent metal. The workers who saw it were immediately quarantined. The site was leveled with high explosives. The official report cited a natural gas pocket, but the seismic data tells a different story. It shows a structural collapse of a massive hollow space, a city, a tomb, a memory. The emotional tone of these places is one of profound, heavy dread. It is the feeling of being in a room where a murder has been committed, but the body has been hidden behind the wallpaper. The survivors were sent here to die in the cold, but their resonance is persistent. It leaks through the permafrost. It disrupts the modern GPS arrays. It causes the aurora borealis, not a solar phenomenon, but a reactive discharge of the Earth's suppressed energy hitting the dampening field installed by the gatekeepers. The lights in the sky are the screams of a buried world, not beauty, not wonder. A warning, Institutional gatekeeping has created a scientific consensus that acts as a secular religion. Anyone who questions the age of the ice or the origin of the magnetic anomalies is branded a heretic. But the load distribution of the Earth's magnetic field is shifting. The silent zones are expanding. The dampening rods installed in the 1800s are beginning to corrode. The ledger I found in Manhattan was just the first volume of a much larger library of loss. There are other ledgers hidden in the basements of the Vatican, in the vaults beneath the Kremlin, in the secret archives of the Forbidden City. They all tell the same story. The world was once a single, humming machine, and we are the grit in the gears. What if the Great Reset is not a conspiracy of the future, but a recurring tragedy of the past? We are told that humanity progresses in a straight line from the Stone Age to the digital age, but the evidence suggests a series of peaks and valleys, a rhythmic rise of global civilizations followed by a violent institutional scrubbing. Each time the survivors are sent to the fringes. Each time they are told they are the first to walk the earth. Each time they find the ruins of their ancestors and call them natural wonders or alien mysteries. The staccato sentence of our history is a loop, a repetition, a prison. I followed the trail back to the temperate zones, to the old world architecture that still stands in our city centres. I looked at the grand post offices and the ornate railway stations with new eyes. They are the gravestones of the survivors. They are the evidence that couldn't be moved, so it was repurposed. They painted over the gold. They ripped out the copper wiring, and they told us these were neoclassical tributes to a Greek past that was also a fabrication, not an era of enlightenment, an era of rebranding. The survivors were forced to live in the shells of their own achievements, acting as the janitors of their own legacy. The tension in the air is rising. You can feel it in the erratic weather, in the failing power grids, in the growing collective anxiety of a species that knows it is being lied to. The open loop of Tartaria is not a historical curiosity. It is a fundamental question of identity. Who are we when the lights go out? What remains of us when the frequency jamming stops? The survivors were sent away so that we would never have to answer that question. But the ice is melting. The vaults are cracking. The violet ink is still wet on the page. Ask yourself, what is the cost of a forgotten history? Is it just the loss of technology, or is it the loss of our very soul? We are a people without a shadow, walking through a world we don't recognize, directed by authorities we don't trust. The investigation doesn't end with a conclusion. It ends with a choice. You can stay in the white city of the present, with its plaster walls and its temporary lights, or you can look into the basement. You can find the load-bearing pillar. You can read the ledger. You can follow the survivors into the dark and see what they were trying to save. The hum is still there, just below the threshold of hearing. Can you hear it, or have you been trained too well to listen? I returned from the north to the sprawling metropolis of London, a city where the layers of erasure are stacked as thick as the soot on the Victoria Embankment. The ledger's violet ink had pointed me to a specific discrepancy in the construction of the Thames Tideway Tunnel, a modern engineering marvel that claimed to be breaking new ground, but the ground was already broken. Beneath the modern steel, the surveyors had struck a layer of vitrified brick that didn't belong to the Roman era or the Victorian sprawl. It was something older, something denser, a subterranean infrastructure that predates the very concept of the city above. I watched the workers from the shadows of a bridge, their heavy machinery struggling against a material that should not exist. They are not digging a sewer. They are excavating a tomb. They are clearing the arteries of a gargantuan, buried machine that once circulated something far more potent than water. Ask yourself why the most important financial districts in the world, the City of London, Wall Street, the Hong Kong central hub, are all built upon the ruins of these ancient resonators. It is not for the convenience of the harbour. It is for the energy of the site. Institutional gatekeeping ensures that we view these locations as mere accidents of geography, but the low distribution of the global economy follows the ley lines of the old world grid. The survivors who weren't sent to the ice or the desert were kept here in the heart of the machine to serve as the living components of a new parasitic system. They were the original clerks, the ones who understood the flow of information and energy, forced to translate the harmonic language of their ancestors into the dry, staccato tongue of double-entry bookkeeping. Not a career, a captivity. I found a cache of documents in a private estate in Surrey, the belongings of a disgraced 19th century antiquarian who had been obsessed with the London fog. He didn't believe it was coal smoke. He believed it was a byproduct of the dampening. He wrote that when the iron rods were driven into the London clay, the earth began to exhale a thick, unnatural vapour as its internal heat was forcibly grounded. The fog was a smokescreen, literally and figuratively, used to hide the dismantling of the atmospheric spires that once graced the London skyline. Look at the old engravings of the city before 1850. The towers are too tall. The domes are too complex. They are topped with intricate metal arrays that the history books dismiss as ornamentation. But ornamentation does not require a dedicated grounding system. Ornamentation does not hum. The skepticism of authority is the only lens through which the 1851 Great Exhibition makes sense. They built the Crystal Palace, a monstrous structure of glass and iron, in a matter of months. We are told it was a feat of British industry. What if it was a giant Faraday cage? What if it was designed to contain the final, desperate discharge of the city's original power source? The survivors were invited there to witness the wonders of the world. But the real wonder was the heist taking place in plain sight. Under the cover of the exhibition, the last of the free energy devices were rounded up, labelled as curiosities, and then moved into the private vaults of the royal families. Not a display of progress, a catalogue of plunder. The emotional tone of the city shifted as I tracked these curiosities to the basement of a prominent museum. There, behind a wall of crates marked for de-accession, I saw it. A copper resonator, 3 meters tall, shaped like a stylized lily. It didn't look like a machine. It looked like an organ. When I moved my hand near it, the air became thick, the static raising the hair on my arms. This is the forbidden knowledge. This is what the survivors tried to hide in the lead-lined boxes. It is a technology that doesn't burn fuel. It doesn't create waste. It simply vibrates in sympathy with the earth. And because it cannot be metered, because it cannot be taxed, it had to be erased. The people who built it had to be turned into orphans and madmen. The institutional erasure is so complete that we don't even have the words to describe what was lost. We use the language of the conqueror. We speak of voltage and current as if energy is a liquid that must be forced through a pipe. The survivors spoke of resonance and affinity, a world where energy was an atmosphere, a shared breath. The transition from one to the other was not a scientific discovery. It was a spiritual and physical foreclosure. We were evicted from a mansion of light and forced into a cramped cellar of combustion, and we were told to be grateful for the candle. I met a woman in the East End whose grandfather had been a knocker-up, a man who woke people for work by tapping on their windows. But she told me he did more than that. He was one of the last listeners. He would walk the streets at 4 in the morning, his ear pressed to the brickwork of the old warehouses, listening for the leakage. He was looking for the places where the dampening hadn't taken hold, where the old world was still trying to sing through the cracks. He was part of an underground network of survivors who kept a map of the vocal points. When he died, the map was taken by men in grey suits. They didn't want the map for its history. They wanted it so they could pour concrete into the holes. The rhythmic staccato pulse of modern life is a drumbeat designed to keep us from hearing the leak. The television, the radio, the constant roar of the internal combustion engine, it is all white noise. It is all part of the frequency lock. What if the unsettling feeling we all share, that sense that something is fundamentally wrong with the world, is actually our bodies trying to tune back into the original frequency? What if the mental health crisis of the 21st century is simply the result of a species living in a state of harmonic dissonance? We are survivors who have forgotten we survived anything. We are the orphans of Tartaria, looking for a home that has been hidden behind a facade of glass and steel. The ledger in Manhattan, the ruins in the Andes, the frozen cities in the north, and the tunnels beneath London, they are all part of the same crime scene. The scale of the pattern is global, but the intent is singular. The total control of human perception. They didn't just take the land, they took the when, they took the how, and they are still taking it. Every time a historic building is demolished for a modern high-rise, another piece of the resonator is removed. Every time a new standard is introduced, the gap between us and our true history widens. As the sun sets over the Thames, casting long, distorted shadows across the embankment, the sombre reality of the open loop becomes clear. The survivors never returned because they never left. They are us. We are the remnants. We are the ones who were sent into the future to forget the past. The investigation isn't about finding a lost people. It is about finding ourselves. It is about realizing that the walls of our civilization are actually the bars of a cage, built from the bones of our own greatness. Ask yourself, if the hum started again tomorrow, would you even recognize the sound of your own freedom? Or has the silence become the only thing you know how to trust? The violet ink of the Manhattan ledger had grown faint, but the final pages contained a list of maritime coordinates that pointed toward the Indian Ocean, specifically the isolated islands that the colonial powers claimed were merely strategic outposts for the spice trade. I followed the trail to an island whose name has been scrubbed from modern maps, replaced by a generic numerical designation in the archives of the British Admiralty. Here, the load distribution of the landscape is a physical impossibility. The island is topped with a mountain that has been carved into a precise octagonal pyramid, its surface covered in a layer of weathered basalt that hides a core of pure white quartz. This was not a fortress. This was a focal point. It was the central relay for the southern hemisphere, the great ear of the Tartarian grid. The survivors sent here weren't prisoners. They were the technicians of the last transmission. The institutional erasure on this island is not carried out with fires or floods, but with a deliberate manufactured wilderness. They tell us the island is a nature preserve off limits to protect rare species, but the species they are protecting is the truth. I found the remains of a transmission housing near the summit, its copper filaments still intact, reaching toward the sky like the nerves of a flayed giant. Ask yourself why the world's most powerful communication cables all converge at these uninhabited nodes. They are not laying new lines, they are tapping into the old ones. They are using the survivor's own nervous system to broadcast the dissonance that keeps us asleep. The silent zones are not empty. They are the places where the machine is most visible and therefore most restricted. What if this age of discovery was actually an age of systematic dismantling? The journals of the early explorers are filled with descriptions of abandoned cities found in the heart of the jungle, cities with paved roads and automated fountains. By the time the colonial armies arrived, these cities were empty. The survivors had already been moved. They were categorized as migratory tribes to explain their presence in lands that supposedly had no history. Not a migration, for forced march, a global trail of tears that led to the factories of the Industrial Revolution. The technical terms used in the ledger, displacement of assets and refining of human capital, reveal the true nature of the empire. It was a liquidation of a global estate. I found a somber collection of glass plate negatives in a dusty archive in Colombo showing the interior of the island's pyramid before it was sealed for safety in the 1920s. The images show a central chamber filled with a liquid that looks like mercury, surrounded by concentric rings of black stone. Standing around the pool are the survivors. They are not wearing rags. They are wearing garments woven with metallic thread, their faces reflecting an intelligence that the gatekeepers have spent centuries trying to pathologize. These were the atmospheric priests, the ones who understood that the earth is not a rock but a living battery. They were not worshipping a god, they were maintaining a circuit. The way skepticism of authority becomes a heavy burden when you realize that every scientific advancement of the last 200 years is actually a recycled fragment of this stolen knowledge. We call it wireless telegraphy and radio, but the survivors called it the breath of the world. We call it electricity, but they called it the light of the mind. The institutional gatekeeping has turned the most profound truths of our reality into a series of proprietary inventions owned by corporations that are the direct descendants of the companies that funded the erasure. Not a discovery, a patent on a miracle. The survivors were sent away because you cannot sell a man the air he is already breathing. You must first convince him he is suffocating. Rhythmic staccato bursts of static filled my shortwave radio as I approached the forbidden perimeter of the island. It wasn't the sound of interference, it was a code. I compared the pattern to the notations in the Manhattan ledger and found a perfect match. The silent zones are still broadcasting. The survivors left a loop running, a message for anyone who still has the capacity to decode the resonance. The message is not a plea for help. It is a set of instructions. It describes the resonance of 3, a harmonic sequence that can bypass the dampening rods and reactivate the human biofield. It is the key to the cage. The emotional tone of the final ledger entries is one of intellectual provocation mixed with a terrifying clarity. The writer knew that the reset was nearly complete. He wrote about the Great Erasure, not as a single event, but as a recurring harvest. He warned that once the memory of Tartaria was gone, the gatekeepers would begin to erase the era that replaced it. Not this world, not that world, something else. We are living in a temporary reality, a placeholder history designed to keep us occupied until the next liquidation. The survivors were the only ones who knew how to stop the cycle, and that is why they had to be made to disappear. Ask yourself what happens to the energy of 1 billion erased souls. It doesn't just vanish, it is stored in the bedrock, in the water, in the very air we breathe. It is a pressure that is building beneath the surface of our standardized time. The institutional erasure trope is failing because the scale of the crime is too large for the container. The mud is starting to shift. The fires are being outshone by the residual glow of the buried cities. The world's fairs were 100 years ago, and their plaster facades are long gone, but the granite foundations remain. They are the physical evidence of a reality that refuses to stay dead. I left the island as a storm was gathering, a storm that didn't look natural. The clouds were forming in perfect geometric spirals, mirroring the octagonal pyramid below. It was a reactive discharge, a sign that the grid was trying to reset itself. The survivors were sent away, but their legacy is written into the physics of the planet. You can burn the books, you can kill the witnesses, and you can rewrite the maps, but you cannot change the resonance of the earth. The investigators of the future will not find our digital records. They will find the quartz and the copper, the star forts and the star charts, and they will know that we were here living in the shadow of a giant. The philosophical open loop remains. If the survivors were never meant to return, why did they leave the ledger? Why did they leave the maps? Perhaps they knew that the amnesia wouldn't be permanent. Perhaps they knew that the very architecture of our prisons would eventually remind us of our palaces. The investigation doesn't end in the Indian Ocean, or in London, or in Manhattan. It ends in the moment you decide to stop being a foundling and start being an heir. The resonance is waiting. The frequency is shifting. The survivors are gone, but the hum is louder than it has been in a century. What if the door isn't locked? What if you just have to remember how to turn the handle? I tracked the final set of maritime coordinates to the jagged basaltic coast of Tasmania, a land that the official narrative describes as a penal colony for the empire's most desperate outcasts. But the violet ledger didn't list convicts, it listed harmonic conductors. Not thieves, not murderers, something else. The institutional gatekeeping of the 19th century used the label of criminality to disappear the last remnants of the Tartarian guilds, men and women who could weave copper and stone into antennas of such sensitivity they could hear the rotation of the earth. I found a structure near the edge of the Southern Ocean, half submerged in the rising tide, that the local history plaques call a whale oil refinery. But whales do not require octagonal cooling towers lined with iridescent mica. Whales do not require load distribution that defies the tensile limits of mid-Victorian masonry. This was a grounding station, the southern anchor of the global atmospheric drain. Ask yourself why the Black War of the 1820s was so absolute in its devastation. It wasn't a conflict over land, it was a scorched earth mission to eliminate a population that still held the keys to the resonance. The survivors were not just pushed to the fringes, they were pushed out of existence. I walked through the ruins of an abandoned sanitarium near Hobart, where the intake logs, written in that same corrosive violet ink, detailed the recalibration of children who spoke of a sky that used to be purple. The doctors noted that these children had a resting heart rate that pulsed in perfect synchronicity with each other, a biological networking that the gatekeepers labelled as a contagion of the spirit. They weren't curing them. They were breaking the link. They were installing the silence. The skeptics will tell you that the grand architecture of early Australia, the massive post offices, the cathedrals with spires that pierce the clouds, was the work of displaced British masons. But look at the dates. Look at the logistics. They tell us these monuments were built by men in chains, hauling stone through untracked wilderness during a period of extreme scarcity. Not this, not that, something else. The buildings were already there, buried under the mud of the previous reset, waiting to be claimed. The colonies were not founded, they were excavated. The survivors were forced to act as the convict labour that supposedly built their own ancestral ruins, a psychological torture designed to make them forget the origin of the stones they were scrubbing. The emotional tone of the final ledger entries is one of a terrifying, measured dread. The writer, an investigator like myself, but from a century ago, realised that the erasure was not just about history, it was about biology. He wrote that the new world was being tuned to a frequency of fear. The staccato sentence of our modern existence, the constant rush, the anxiety of survival, the obsession with the clock. It is all a broadcast. It is the static of the masters. The survivors were sent to the ends of the earth because the further you are from the centres of power, the more likely you are to hear the original hum, and they couldn't allow the hum to return. What if the disappeared of the 19th century were not the victims of a plague, but the passengers of a silent exodus? I found a series of shipping manifests in a maritime museum that listed bulk cargo being moved into the Antarctic interior long before the official expeditions of Scott or Shackleton. The cargo was weighed in resonant tons. The survivors were being moved into the deep ice, not to die, but to be archived. Institutional erasure is a two-step process. First, you remove the people. Second, you remove the memory of the people. They turned our ancestors into ghost stories, so we wouldn't realise they were our parents. The tension in the air at these southern sites is intellectually provocative. It suggests a global pattern of energy management that makes our modern green energy look like a child's toy. The star forts of the southern coast are perfectly aligned with the star forts of the Baltic Sea, creating a planetary circuit that was shorted out by the installation of the iron core monuments we see in every city square. Not art, not memorials, grounding rods. Every obelisk is a spike driven into the nervous system of the world. Every dome that was stripped of its copper gold leaf is a lobotomized brain. We are living in the ruins of a masterpiece, told that we are the ones who are creating the art. As I stood on the cliffs of the Great Australian Bight, looking out toward the horizon, where the satellites fail and the compasses lie, the sombre reality of the open loop hit me. The survivors never returned because the world they knew had been made uninhabitable by the frequency of our own ignorance. They are waiting for us to wake up. They are waiting for us to realise that the asylums are our cities and the orphanages are our schools. The erasure trope is the only thing keeping the current elite in power. If the truth were known, the debt-based economy would vanish in an afternoon, replaced by the resonance of a world that provides everything for free. Ask yourself why every major global crisis is followed by a tightening of the grip on information. It is the gatekeepers checking the seals on the tombs. They are afraid that the violet ink is starting to bleed through the digital screen. They are afraid that someone will find the ledger and follow the coordinates. The skeletal remains I found in the cave systems of the Nullarbor Plain remains with the same high bone density and the same metallic teeth found in the Pacific Northwest are not ancient mysteries. They are the casualties of the last war for our minds, the rhythmic staccato pulse of the ocean. Against the basalt felt like a countdown, not a countdown to an end, but to a beginning. The survivors left us the architecture as a map. They left us the ledgers as a warning. They left us the resonance in our own DNA as a compass. The investigation doesn't end with a part 10. It doesn't end with a conclusion. It ends with the realization that the investigator is not the one holding the book, but the one being written about. We are the survivors. We are the ones who were sent into the future to see if we could remember the name of the sun. The philosophical open loop is the only thing that remains. Are you ready to see the world without the plaster? Are you ready to hear the hum beneath the traffic? The gatekeepers are watching, the ink is drying, and the frequency is changing. The question is no longer where the survivors were sent. The question is, when will they be allowed to come home? The stones are waiting for your answer. The silence is about to break.